The Boer War concentration camps. Between 1899 and 1902, the British Army was fighting Boer guerrillas in South Africa during the Second Boer War. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, used hit-and-run tactics that frustrated British commanders who had expected a conventional war. British General Lord Kitchener decided on a strategy called scorched earth to eliminate support for the guerrillas. British troops systematically burned Boer farms, destroyed crops, poisoned wells, and slaughtered livestock across the South African countryside. With their farms destroyed, Boer families had nowhere to go. The British Army began rounding up approximately 115,000 Boer women and children, along with over 100,000 black Africans who had worked on the farms. They were transported to hastily constructed camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. These facilities became known as concentration camps, marking one of the first modern uses of that term. The camps were designed to hold populations for extended periods, but British authorities made almost no preparations for sanitation, medical care, or adequate food supplies. Families lived in canvas tents that provided little protection from the harsh South African climate. Water sources became contaminated. In some camps, authorities implemented a system where families of men still in combat received smaller rations than those whose men had surrendered. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded camps. Measles, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia killed thousands. Children were particularly vulnerable. In some camps, the mortality rate exceeded 50%. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, along with more than 20,000 black Africans held in separate facilities. British activist Emily Hobhouse visited the camps in 1901 and was horrified by what she found. She documented the conditions and published reports that eventually caused public outcry in Britain. The government conducted investigations that confirmed the terrible conditions, leading to some reforms. However, the camps continued operating until the war ended in 1902. The camps left deep scars in South African society and became a defining grievance for Afrikaners for generations. The Amritsar Massacre. On April 13, 1919, thousands of Indians gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, a walled public garden in Amritsar, Punjab. Many were attending a peaceful religious festival celebrating Baisakhi, while others had come to protest recent British legislation that allowed imprisonment without trial. British authorities had banned public gatherings, but many attendees were unaware of the order. Around 5:55 p.m., Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with approximately 90 soldiers, most of them Gurkha and Sikh troops under British command. The garden had only one narrow main exit. Dyer positioned his troops to block this entrance, effectively trapping the crowd inside the walled enclosure. Without any warning or order to disperse, Dyer commanded his soldiers to open fire on the unarmed civilians. The troops fired continuously for approximately 10 minutes, shooting 1,650 rounds into the packed crowd. People scrambled desperately to escape, climbing walls or throwing themselves into a well in the garden. The soldiers aimed deliberately at the densest parts of the crowd where people had gathered. They continued firing until their ammunition was nearly exhausted. When the shooting finally stopped, bodies covered the ground. The official British inquiry later reported 379 dead and over 1,200 wounded. Indian sources and subsequent investigations placed the death toll at over 1,000, with many more wounded. Dyer did not allow medical personnel to enter the garden to treat the wounded until the following morning. Many injured people died overnight from blood loss. Dyer defended his actions, stating he wanted to create a moral and widespread effect to terrorize the population into submission. Rather than being court-martialed, Dyer received support from many British officials and members of Parliament. The House of Lords praised him, and supporters raised money to give him a substantial financial reward. He was eventually removed from command, but faced no criminal charges. The massacre galvanized Indian independence movements and convinced many moderate Indians that British rule could never be reformed. It became a turning point that pushed leaders like Gandhi toward demanding complete independence rather than dominion status within the British Empire. The Mau Mau Detention Camps. Between 1952 and 1960, British colonial authorities in Kenya fought an insurgency known as the Mau Mau Uprising. Kenyan activists, primarily from the Kikuyu ethnic group, demanded land rights and independence from colonial rule. The British response involved mass detention on an enormous scale. Colonial authorities detained nearly 1.5 million Kenyans, about one-quarter of the entire Kikuyu population, in a network of detention camps and enclosed villages surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The British government described these facilities as rehabilitation centers designed to reform people who had taken Mau Mau oaths. In reality, they were brutal detention facilities where systematic abuse occurred daily. For decades, the British government denied the scope of atrocities committed in these camps. Files were deliberately destroyed or hidden. However, documents later revealed through Operation Legacy a program to remove incriminating files before granting independence to colonies, proved that the colonial administration sanctioned systematic abuse to extract intelligence and break the Mau Mau movement. Methods included severe beatings, sexual violence, castration, burning of skin, and other forms of torture designed to force confessions or information about Mau Mau activities. Guards treated detainees with extreme cruelty. The most notorious incident occurred at Hola Camp on March 3, 1959. Guards clubbed 11 detainees to death for refusing to work. Colonial authorities initially claimed the men had died from drinking contaminated water. When this lie was exposed, public opinion in Britain began turning against the colonial administration's methods. Investigations revealed that commandants and guards had received tacit approval for harsh treatment from senior colonial officials. The camps destroyed families and communities. Many detainees spent years in detention without formal charges or trials. When Kenya gained independence in 1963, many of those responsible for the camps returned to Britain and faced no accountability. In 2013, after Kenyan survivors filed a lawsuit, the British government issued an apology and agreed to compensate over 5,000 victims, though this represented only a fraction of those who suffered. The Bengal Famine. In 1943, while Britain fought World War II, approximately 3 million people died of starvation and disease in Bengal, a region that included what is now Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal. The famine resulted from a combination of factors including cyclones, flooding, and wartime disruptions, but British policies transformed a food shortage into mass death. Bengal had experienced poor harvests, but the region had not run out of food. The primary issue was distribution and access. As the famine intensified through 1943, rice and grain continued being exported from India to support British war efforts and stockpile food in other parts of the empire. British authorities prioritized feeding the military and ensuring food security in Britain itself over feeding Indian civilians. The British War Cabinet, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, repeatedly denied requests from Indian officials for emergency food shipments. Churchill's cabinet discussed the famine multiple times, but decided against diverting merchant shipping to deliver food aid to Bengal. Churchill blamed the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits and made comments suggesting Indians were somehow responsible for their own starvation. As people died by the thousands daily, British military warehouses in Bengal held large stockpiles of food reserved for troops and potential military needs. Colonial policies prevented these supplies from being released to the starving population. The government also restricted movement of grain within India through trade controls designed to prevent food from reaching areas where it might be seized by Japanese forces if they invaded. Bodies lined the streets of Calcutta. Families abandoned children they couldn't feed. Disease spread as malnutrition weakened immune systems. Provincial governments requested assistance repeatedly, but the central British administration provided minimal relief. Some historians characterize the famine as manslaughter through deliberate policy decisions that prioritized military and political objectives over Indian lives. The British government's actions during the famine further eroded any remaining Indian support for colonial rule and strengthened demands for independence, which came 4 years later in 1947. The Batang Massacre. On December 12, 1948, a patrol of Scots Guards from the 2nd Battalion entered a rubber plantation village at Batang in Selangor, British Malaya. Britain was fighting communist insurgents during what became known as the Malayan Emergency. The patrol, consisting of 14 soldiers, arrived at the village around dawn. They rounded up all the residents and separated the men from the women and children. The soldiers locked the women and children in several buildings. They then divided the 24 adult and teenage males into 2 groups and took them to different locations on the plantation. According to the official British Army report, the villagers were shot while attempting to escape. Soldiers claimed the men had been released to gather their belongings, but then tried to run away, forcing the troops to open fire. However, evidence and witness statements painted a very different picture. The women and children who survived reported that they heard sustained gunfire, but no warnings or shouts to halt. The bodies, when recovered, showed that victims had been shot at close range, many with multiple wounds. No villagers were armed. Local investigations found the bodies clustered together rather than spread out as would be expected if people were running away. Several soldiers later admitted that the killings had been premeditated. One soldier told reporters decades later that they had been ordered to kill the villagers. Another described how the men were shot in groups without any attempt to escape. The massacre was sometimes called Britain's My Lai, comparing it to the infamous American atrocity in Vietnam. Despite evidence of wrongdoing, no soldiers were ever prosecuted. The British government conducted several inquiries over the following decades, but each time decided not to pursue charges. In 1970, survivors requested a new investigation after soldiers came forward with confessions. The government refused. In 2012, the British High Court ruled against survivors who sought a public inquiry, stating too much time had passed. Although the UK has now issued statements of regret and apology, they still resist full legal accountability. The Chagossian Expulsion. Between 1968 and 1973, the British government forcibly removed the entire population of the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. Approximately 2,000 Chagossians, descendants of enslaved Africans and Indian laborers who had lived on the islands for generations, were expelled to make way for a United States military base on Diego Garcia, the largest island. The British government had secretly leased Diego Garcia to the United States military. To facilitate the base construction, authorities decided the islands needed to be emptied of their inhabitants. Initially, Chagossians who had traveled to Mauritius for medical treatment or other reasons were simply prevented from returning home. Officials told them their islands were closed. Then authorities began systematic removal of the remaining population. To frighten islanders into leaving, British agents killed their pet dogs. Hundreds of dogs were rounded up, herded into sealed sheds, and gassed to death with exhaust fumes while their owners watched and listened. The psychological impact of this deliberate cruelty was devastating. Families were then forced onto cargo ships with minimal belongings. They were transported to Mauritius and the Seychelles, places many had never seen, and dumped on the docks with no money, no housing arrangements, and no support. The Chagossians had lived for generations in a close-knit community with their own culture and Creole language. Suddenly they found themselves homeless and destitute in unfamiliar places, unable to return to their islands. Many struggled with extreme poverty. Some died within years from the trauma and harsh conditions. The British government insisted the Chagossians had been temporary contract workers rather than permanent inhabitants, despite generations of family graves on the islands. This fiction allowed officials to claim no permanent population had been displaced. For decades, Chagossians fought in courts to return home. In 2019, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly demanding Britain return the islands to Mauritius and allow the Chagossians to return. The International Court of Justice ruled that British administration of the islands was unlawful, yet as of now the Chagossians remain unable to return, and the U.S. military base continues operating on Diego Garcia. The Summer Palace Destruction. In October 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French forces captured Beijing. On October 6th, troops discovered the bodies of British and French prisoners who had been tortured and killed by Chinese authorities. The prisoners, including a journalist and a diplomatic envoy, had been negotiating under a flag of truce when they were seized weeks earlier. In retaliation, James Bruce, 8th Earl of Elgin, and the British High Commissioner to China, ordered the complete destruction of the old summer palace, known as Yuan Ming Yuan. The palace complex was one of China's greatest architectural and cultural treasures. It had taken 150 years to build and contained pavilions, gardens, galleries, and temples spread across 860 acres. Inside were countless artworks, ancient manuscripts, porcelain, jade carvings, and other irreplaceable cultural artifacts collected over centuries by Chinese emperors. Before burning it, British and French troops spent 3 days systematically looting the palace. Soldiers filled wagons with gold, silver, jade, porcelain, paintings, and silk. Officers claimed the most valuable items. The looting was so extensive that auction houses in London and Paris spent years selling the stolen artifacts. Many pieces remain in British museums and private collections today. On October 18th, Elgin ordered 3,500 British troops to burn the entire complex to the ground. The destruction took 3 days. Flames consumed wooden structures, gardens, and libraries. The heat was so intense that stone and marble structures cracked and collapsed. When the fires finally burned out, one of Asia's greatest cultural monuments had been reduced to ruins. The destruction was purely punitive, designed to humiliate the Chinese emperor and demonstrate British power. The burning had no military value. The atrocity shocked even some British officials. One officer wrote that the destruction was wretchedly demoralizing work for an army. The ruins remain today as a memorial to what was lost. Chinese authorities have deliberately left the site partially destroyed, as a reminder of the humiliation suffered during the century of humiliation under foreign powers. The destruction of the Summer Palace became a symbol of Western imperialism's cultural destruction in China. Bloody Sunday. On November 21, 1920, during the Irish War of Independence, British forces entered Croke Park Stadium in Dublin during a Gaelic football match between Dublin and Tipperary. Earlier that morning, the Irish Republican Army had assassinated 14 British intelligence officers in coordinated attacks across Dublin. The operation had been ordered by Michael Collins to eliminate the Carrow Gang, a group of undercover agents and assassins targeting IRA leadership. In retaliation, British forces decided to strike at civilians. Around 3:15 p.m., trucks carrying British auxiliaries in black and tans, paramilitary police forces known for brutal reprisals, surrounded Croke Park. Approximately 5,000 spectators were watching the match. Without warning, Armored cars entered the ground, and troops opened fire on the crowd. Soldiers fired rifles and machine guns indiscriminately into the stands and onto the playing field. People scrambled desperately to escape, climbing walls and trampling each other in panic. One Tipperary player, Michael Hogan, was shot dead on the field. 14 civilians were killed, including 3 children. Over 60 people were wounded. British authorities claimed they had come to search for weapons and IRA members, and that someone in the crowd had fired first, forcing them to return fire. However, no weapons were found on any of the victims, and forensic evidence showed most victims had been shot from outside the stadium, not from within the crowd. The incident became known as the first Bloody Sunday in Irish history. It galvanized Irish public opinion against British rule and strengthened support for independence. The dead became martyrs, and Croke Park became a symbol of British oppression. The GAA, which runs Gaelic sports, banned British security forces from attending matches, a rule that remained in place for decades. Today, a part of Croke Park Stadium is named the Hogan Stand in honor of the player killed that day. The Partition of India. In 1947, the British government decided to grant independence to India, but partitioned the country into 2 separate nations, India and Pakistan. The partition was executed with catastrophic haste. The British appointed Cyril Radcliffe, a lawyer who had never been to India and knew nothing about the region, to draw the border lines. Radcliffe was given just 5 weeks to divide the entire subcontinent. He worked from outdated maps and census data, drawing lines that split communities, divided families, and separated people from their ancestral lands. The borders cut through Punjab and Bengal, regions with mixed Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh populations. When the borders were announced on August 17, 1947, 2 days after independence, millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the new international boundaries. Hindus and Sikhs in what became Pakistan fled toward India. Muslims in India fled toward Pakistan. The mass migration became the largest in human history, with approximately 14 million people displaced. As refugees traveled, communal violence erupted on a massive scale. Trains carrying refugees were attacked, with entire carriages of people murdered. Mobs attacked refugee columns on roads. Villages were burned. Women were abducted and assaulted. Families were separated in the chaos. The violence spiraled out of control. British military forces remained in both countries during the transition period, but they largely failed to intervene to stop the massacres. In some cases, British officers withdrew troops from areas where violence was predictable, leaving civilians unprotected. The death toll remains disputed, but estimates range from 200,000 to 2 million people killed in the partition violence. The British government's decision to rush the partition, combined with inadequate security measures and poor planning, directly contributed to one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. The scars of partition remain visible today in the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan. The Opium Wars. Between 1839 and 1860, Britain fought 2 wars against China that were essentially conflicts to protect Britain's drug trafficking operations. British merchants had been importing opium from India into China for decades, creating a massive addiction crisis among the Chinese population. Millions of Chinese people became addicted to opium, devastating families and communities across the country. The Chinese government, seeing the destruction caused by opium addiction, attempted to stop the drug trade. In 1839, Chinese officials confiscated and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants in Canton. Britain responded by declaring war. British naval forces, with superior military technology, bombarded Chinese ports and cities. Chinese defenses were no match for British warships and modern artillery. After defeating Chinese forces in the First Opium War, Britain imposed the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. The treaty forced China to pay massive reparations to Britain for the destroyed opium, essentially making China pay for the drugs that had been poisoning its population. China was also forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain and open 5 ports to British trade, including unrestricted opium trade. When China attempted to resist continued opium imports in the 1850s, Britain launched the Second Opium War alongside France. Again, superior Western military power overwhelmed Chinese defenses. The resulting treaties forced China to legalize opium and open even more ports to Western trade. The Opium Wars represented Britain acting as a state-sponsored drug cartel, using military force to ensure profits from narcotics trafficking. The wars humiliated China and began what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation, when Western powers exploited and carved up Chinese territory. The forced legalization of opium continued devastating Chinese society for generations, with addiction rates soaring and social problems multiplying. The Tasmanian Genocide. During the 1820s and early 1830s, British colonists in Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, engaged in systematic killing of the indigenous Aboriginal population. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people had lived on the island for at least 35,000 years before British colonization began in 1803. As British settlers expanded across the island, they pushed Aboriginal people off their traditional lands. Conflicts erupted as Aboriginal groups resisted the invasion of their territories. British authorities and settlers responded with extreme violence. Settler militias and soldiers hunted Aboriginal people, shooting them on sight. Poisoned flour was left out deliberately to kill Aboriginal families. Children were taken from their parents. Women were kidnapped and forced into servitude. The violence escalated into what became known as the Black War. In 1830, Lieutenant Governor George Arthur organized the Black Line, an operation where approximately 2,200 settlers and soldiers formed a human chain across the island. They marched from north to south, attempting to corral all remaining Aboriginal people into the Tasman Peninsula. The operation was a military failure, capturing only a handful of people. However, the systematic violence and disease introduced by colonists had already devastated the Aboriginal population. By the 1830s, only a few hundred Aboriginal Tasmanians survived from an original population estimated at 3,000 to 15,000. George Augustus Robinson, a British missionary, convinced the remaining survivors to relocate to Flinders Island, promising them safety and provision. Instead, conditions on Flinders Island were terrible. Poor food, inadequate shelter, and disease killed most of the relocated population within years. Truganini, often called the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal person, died in 1876. The Tasmanian case is frequently cited by historians and genocide scholars as one of the only documented examples of a successful complete genocide, where an entire distinct population was eliminated. British colonization effectively destroyed Tasmania's Aboriginal people and their culture within a single generation. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.